I'm David Scobie. I'm the Executive Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, one of the 7 divisions at the university. The programs in our division range from media studies to writing to international affairs to urban policy and many others. And what binds them all together, as the new name of our division implies, is a commitment to interdisciplinary engagement with the largest issues of public culture and public affairs. And that makes us especially proud to partner with the Nation and Nation Books on a whole range of wonderful discussions and forums on matters of public interest, and especially tonight's discussion of Christian Parenti's book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. Nothing better exemplifies our own values and our commitments than this partnership and tonight's event. We are grateful to be hosting it and to be co-sponsoring it with Nation Books and Demos and Democracy Now! Originally, Amy Goodman was meant to discuss Christian Parenti's book. Unfortunately, she's been called away. We know from her blog, called away to London in the hopes of interviewing Julian Assange unexpectedly and urgently. And we are delighted to have, as a pinch hitter, Laura Flanders, who's going to be leading the discussion about Tropic of Chaos. You may know Laura as the founder and host of GRITtv, and also the editor of a forthcoming book, At the Tea Party. So we are delighted you're here, we're delighted Laura's here, and we're honored to be hosting this discussion.
All right, it's great to have you. It's great to have you hosting us, and for me to be able to host Christian. I guess I was called away from Britain while Amy was called away to Britain. It's, you know, it's win and lose, it's all the same. This book, for people that haven't read it yet, and I can't stress this strongly enough, is not only critically important in the reporting that it brings to the fore, and the passion and empathy that Christian brings to his work, as he does to all his work, but it is really a beautiful read. And I think that sometimes in our discussion of nonfiction, we ignore the craft. And I think Betsy Reed is here, who may have had something to do with how beautiful this is, but this is Christian's work, and his work is stellar, not just from the reporting side, but from the writing quality. It's worth the read, not just for what you'll learn. So with that, let me just tell you a little bit about Christian in case you haven't read the back of the book or quite remembered where you know Christian from. He is, as you know, a regular contributing editor to The Nation magazine. He's a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute and a visiting scholar at the City University. And it goes on. He's the author of Lockdown America, The Soft Cage, The Freedom, and he's written for just about every good magazine that exists outside of the Nation, of which there are just a few, you know. He lives in Brooklyn, and this book begins this way, and I wanted Christian to take off from where he begins the book, because it's a powerful beginning. The first chapter is called Who Killed Ikaru Laruman? Ikaru Laruman lay beneath a flat-topped acacia tree, its latticework of branches casting a soft mesh of shade upon his body. He wore a silver earring and khaki shorts and lay on his side with his arm twisted awkwardly beneath him. The left side of Ikaru's forehead was gone, blown away by the exit of a bullet. His blood formed a greasy black slick on the desert floor. His sandals, shawl, and gun had been stolen. Ikaru had been a pastoralist from the Turkana tribe who live in northwest Kenya on the arid savannas of the Rift Valley, and he goes on. Christian, why was Ikaru not just a victim of tribal conflict?
Well, he was at the first level a victim of tribal conflict about cattle raiding, killed by the Pokot, who are the neighboring tribe. But the context in which that specific struggle happened, to my mind, means that he was killed in part by climate change and the catastrophic convergence of climate change with the pre-existing problems of neoliberal economic restructuring throughout the global south that has created inequality and increased poverty, and the legacy of the Cold War, which has seeded much of the global South with cheap, light weapons. And real concretely, what happened with ECRU is that the northwest of Kenya is, like the entire region, in the midst of a very bad drought that's been going on for almost a decade. And the herders, their animals are dying, and so to replenish their herds, they're raiding from each other, stealing from each other, which they've always done. But it's become increasingly violent and intense, in part because this weapons have flown in from Uganda and Somalia, and the drought has really decimated the herds. And what you might ask, well, okay, the borehole where ECRU had his animals was close to his enemies. Why was he there in this time of crisis? Why couldn't he move somewhere else? Part of the answer is that the government, since the 1990s, has been liberalizing the economy and withdrawing itself from supporting farmers, poor farmers, and pastoralists. So there were less options, there's less infrastructure for people like ECRU. So all of these things come together, and he was killed by a combination of all of those things, to my mind, and that, to some extent, makes him a victim of climatologically driven violence.
I should say we're going to talk for about 45 minutes and then take some of your questions written down, so just bear that in mind. My next question is, how did you get to this topic? Because the last time I think I talked to you, it was about Afghanistan, and you'd been trekking across the wilds of Afghanistan following the conflict there. How did you go from that very recognizable conflict to this Tropic of Chaos?
Partly it was reporting in Afghanistan, reporting on the poppy economy, and when I first did a story, one for The Nation and one for the London Review of Books back in, I think, 2004, and the farmers said, when I asked them, why are you growing this illegal crop that the government is trying to eradicate and is dangerous? And part of the answer would always include the drought, and I hadn't heard of the drought, and it wasn't really part of the discussion among people in Kabul, NGOs, and then a couple of years later, I did another set of stories on poppy and heroin, and again, people would say in different parts of Afghanistan, say, well, the drought is really important and why we make this choice. So I looked into it, and it turns out poppy, the farmers told me this, that poppy uses 1/5 the water that wheat uses. So it's an adaptive crop. It's a crop that you can make money on in these drought conditions. And I look at it, and sure enough, Afghanistan is suffering the worst drought in living memory. And so I was going to write a book about Afghanistan, but I had always been concerned about climate change and about our civilization's relationship to the planet, which, since I was a teenager, I was concerned by that. And it really began once when I was 17 or 18, stumbling upon in the garbage in Cambridge, or on the street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a copy of the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth. And ever since then, I was like, this could be serious. And so out of that reporting in Afghanistan, I assumed that this issue I was concerned about, climate change, was in fact linked to these more, as you put it, recognizable issues and struggles, and proceeded to look for other examples. And it wasn't that hard to find examples of an environmental aspect to conflict, and that environmental aspect being linked to climate change and the crisis of extreme and erratic weather that climate change causes.
You say that the climate change that we're witnessing is exacerbating war and strife, also religious violence. How so?
Well, because climate change the social effects of climate change rarely look as simple as people being displaced by a storm or something from one place to another. It's more often than not transmitted through and transmogrified through other institutions and other problems. So you get, in Afghanistan, for example, you have, what is that, a religious war at a certain level. It's an ethnic war. The Pashtun are fighting a religious war. The Taliban is, along with being a religious movement, is primarily an ethnic movement of the Pashtun, who are the minority in Afghanistan and live in the south. Part of their war is against the Tajiks in the north, who they see as dominating the government and dominating the country and working with foreigners. So if my thesis is correct, that part of why young men go and fight for the Taliban has to do with climate change, because to back up a second, the Afghan government and NATO attacks poppy, the Taliban defends poppy. So along with all the other ideas that might motivate a young Taliban soldier, there's this other material incentive which has to do with the drought and climate change, which is that this side of the conflict, the Taliban, are supporting their right to grow this adaptive crop. So they don't understand this as a climate war. I mean, they see it as a religious war and an ethnic war. So that's an example of how it comes out as religious warfare. Another example from that same region, kind of working backwards, is what happened in Kyrgyzstan in 2010. In the spring of 2010, people might remember that there were ethnic riots between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, and the capital, Bishkek, was on fire, and the president fell, and the new president actually called for Russian troops to intervene, and the Russians very wisely declined. And that looked like, just age-old enmities between these two peoples who live next to each other, live together in this one country. But I looked into it, and sure enough, there's a very clear climate aspect to this ethnic violence. Kyrgyzstan is a country that gets 90% of its electricity from hydroelectric, these large old Soviet dams. And the same drought that has been punishing Afghanistan has been punishing Kyrgyzstan. So by 2005, 2006, 2007, water levels were really dropping in these dams, and they had to start rationing power by 2008 and 2009 because there wasn't enough water. At the same time, a really extreme winter, a dry, cold winter descended, killed lots of the cattle herds, broke pipes in the cities, pensioners froze to death. The government was already rationing power, industry had to shut down, so unemployment rose. Then come spring, the president, embracing neoliberal economic orthodoxy, decided he was going to sell off the power system, the dams and the utility lines. So to make the assets more attractive, he doubled the power tariff. And so what initially drove people into the streets of Bishkek in April 2010 was this power, this increase in the price of power. And then that devolved into this ethnic violence with pogroms and neighborhoods burning each other out. So that's an example of what is definitely an ethnic conflict, but has a very clear climatological aspect to it. It's not reducible to that, but as climate change becomes more intense, that sort of element of the causality in these conflicts becomes more pronounced.
I heard the Arab Spring, so-called, and I always object to that phrase because it sounds like it was sort of an inevitable function of the weather. But I heard the Arab Spring be related, the protests in Egypt in particular, in Tunisia, related to the price of grain. Is that a global warming phenomenon too? I
think you could argue that. I mean, that was done writing the book by the time that was all beginning. But I'm now working on an article about that. And, some of the precipitating events are climatologically. I mean, of course, the primary thing was people in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya wanting to get rid of these police states that were corrupt and oppressing them and mismanaging the economy. But why now? Why not a couple years ago? One possible explanation could be that in 2010, there was very, very bad rain in the US and Canada, which damaged the corn crop and helped drive corn prices up to 93% of their previous level. Some of that also had to do with the expansion of the use of ethanol. And then in Russia, there was what's called the Black Sea drought, which really extended beyond Russia into a number of the former Soviet republics that are large grain producers. Russia then bans grain exports, and it's one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. Egypt is the largest wheat importer in the world. Egyptians spend 40%, on average, spend 40% of their wages on food. And so the year leading up to the Arab Spring, food inflation was running at 20%. So that's not the whole cause, the whole story, but it certainly seems to me to be an element in why this happened. And and the price of food and basic necessities was very much an issue in those protests. I mean, of course, in the mainstream media in the West, I think tends to talk about freedom of expression and, you know, foreground the role of Twitter and Facebook and all that, and to ignore the kind of more class issues which have a climatological angle to them.
What, our media focus on technology rather than class?
Not all of the
Surely
media,
you jest.
Yeah.
What about the U.S.? Do we see climate wars here? Skirmishes?
Well, I mean, the Pentagon imagines them. The Pentagon is you know, planning for them, and they see not an increase of interstate conflict, but they imagine that over the coming decades, that as climate change kicks in and there's more and more migration and weak states collapse into civil war, and there's, you know, outright state failure, the armed forces are going to be called on to intervene in these. And that puts front and center in their thinking counterinsurgency and that type of small-scale intervention. So we don't have climate wars here yet, but you can definitely see the connections between weather events here and violence somewhere else. And I mean, you can draw these like ricocheting causalities on and on and on. So a friend of mine, Ted Ham, who's editor of the Brooklyn Rail, is in Senegal with his wife right now, and there are riots there. And one of the key causes of it is the price of diesel, because all the electricity comes from diesel. One of the reasons that fuel prices have gone up, oil prices have gone up, one of the reasons that Obama responded by releasing some of the strategic reserve has to do with Libya coming offline and the rest of the chaos in the Middle East, which is not reducible to, but is linked to these weather events. And so now there are riots in Senegal. So there's this preparation among military intellectuals and the Pentagon for managing this future through kind of open-ended global counterinsurgency. So there's that kind of engagement with climate wars. And then on the border, I think one can see the initial outlines of a very frightening future. And this all may sound kind of crazy, but I mean, if you look at the science and what the implications are and the trajectory of emissions that we're on, it's pretty clear that there is only going to be more and more social and economic dislocation. And the primary way that people are going to adapt is with violence. And so you see on the border, the militarization of the border, the rhetoric of people like Michelle Bachmann. And even in the nooks and crannies of that movement, there are some sort of right-wing Greens who talk about a militarized border and wanting to crack down on immigrants in environmental terms. And you could imagine where that could go. So that's not quite warfare, but it's a kind of rhetoric and a posture and an infrastructure of violence that is developing and increasingly knowingly in response to climate change, or at least unknowingly in response to climate change, because one of the real reasons that people are forced to leave their homes is because the environment is off kilter, and particularly in the global south, where people live with a, you know, thinner margin of error economically, a couple of bad years, a couple of droughts can wreak havoc.
You talk in the book about a Mexican small fisherman.
Yeah, this was this guy that I met in Juarez, who was sitting on the banks of the Rio Grande looking north. He had been in the U.S. and he had been deported, and he was in Juarez saying that, you know, explaining to me how he really wanted to stay out of the drug war, I mean, out of the drug trade, but he wasn't really sure what else he could do. And his plight began in the mid-1990s when there was an El Nino event, winter of 97, 98. People may recall it affected California quite badly in this country. And in Michoacan, where he was from, the warm water created a toxic algae bloom that drove away the fish. Because Mexico had been liberalizing its economy since the mid-1980s, promoted by the debt crisis and the promise of a free trade agreement with the U.S., by the time NAFTA this culminates in NAFTA in 1994. By the time this guy was facing this red tide, there was very little public infrastructure for him to fall back on for support. So he had to borrow money on the open market and try and survive. He didn't make it. He lost his boat, and he had to migrate. So you could say, well, is he a climate refugee? Was he forced to move because of the El Nino, which fits the patterns that climate scientists predict? I mean, I'm not saying that, one cannot say that this weather event or that weather event is definitively caused by climate change, but the general pattern is clear, and the associations of increased CO2 emissions, rising temperature, and more chaotic weather. So, I mean, was he a victim of climate change in that regard, or of neoliberal economic restructuring? I mean, clearly both, and that's the point of the book. I continually use this idea of a catastrophic convergence of how these three things, the prehistory of, the pre-existing crisis of neoliberalism with the inequality and poverty it creates, and the legacy of the Cold War with all the cheap weapons and the smuggling networks and the paramilitary organizations that has left behind, now being exacerbated by climate change.
So I guess one of my questions is, what difference does it make in terms of our response? I mean, I'm sure everybody here is now extra devastated to understand that there's another level of explanation of huge, seemingly irresolvable problem related to all the already existing problems that we understand of neoliberalism and imperialism and greed. What difference does it make to our strategy as progressive people trying to reduce war, increase sustainability, increase the sort of possibility of the survival of the planet, to understand that there's a climate factor that doesn't necessarily function alone, functions with all these others? It could leave an awful lot of us feeling kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah, yeah, it makes me feel pretty overwhelmed. But I mean, one of the key things that I have come away from writing this book with, which I suppose I entered writing the book with this notion as well, which is the centrality of the state to capitalism. I mean, most of the books I've written about have been about the state, more like generally a critique of the capitalist state and its repression and surveillance. But I also feel that there is a lack of understanding on the left and an open denial on the right about the importance of the government in the reproduction of capitalism, that there is no such thing as capitalism without a government, without a public sector, without rules. And the scale of the problems we now face, I think, force us to return to the question of the legitimacy of the government and what its capacities are, and to think and talk explicitly about how we can reinvigorate the democratic and progressive elements of the state that, for example, force some redistribution from the rich to the poor through taxation and jobs programs, stuff like that. And that the project of adaptation to climate change and the mitigation of its causes is going to involve the state front and center. And it's either going to be a kind of fascist, violent response, or there's going to have to be a re-engagement with planning and a role for public ownership and a role for the state at guiding the economy in the directions that it needs to go to confront these challenges.
GRITtv covered the Cochabamba conference in Bolivia to some extent. There were some examples there of national responses. Are there any that you have as a favorite to sort of lift up where you feel like governments are responding in a healthy way?
Well, I end with a discussion of Bolivia, partly because the Bolivian government has really spoken out quite courageously about climate change in these international negotiations. They have been punished by the U.S., had some of their development aid cut off because they have said, look, these agreements that we're moving towards are not science-based. This is not realistic, this discussion we're having, and it's not going to solve the problem. They've been, one of the only governments to continually do that. But what they've done on the ground is much harder to measure, and I think much more difficult in terms of developing adaptation and mitigation. I mean, my understanding is that like their development of the lithium for lithium batteries is not moving along very, very quickly. But one reason I write about Bolivia is because it is, I think, quite inspiring. When I was there the first time in 2000 and, I think it was 5 or 6, I forget, 2006, the Carlos Mesa government was teetering on the brink of collapse. There were massive protests, and everyone on the left was saying, you know, this government's going to fall, but the left is incapable of taking power. People in Evo Morales' party, the movement towards socialism, MAS, Movimiento a Socialismo, said to me, Evo's press secretary, I think, said to me, he was like, we're not going to be ready to govern this country for 10 years. You know, the left is just really not organized enough, we're not developed enough. I went back for the nation a year later, and Evo Morales was in power, and they were, ready or not, doing their best to deal with the problems that Bolivia faced. A couple years later, that energy that had been on the street, that rebellious, organized energy, was on the global stage when Pablo Solon was, you know, standing up against all the great countries, all the large countries of the world, and saying, look, we refuse to go along with this. We refuse to provide any kind of window dressing to your failure to achieve science-based reduction targets in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's an inspiring story that even the people who now are in charge of the government of Bolivia a couple years ago were like, well, just because La Paz has been shut down and there are tens of thousands of angry peasants here and the old government is about to collapse, you know, don't get your hopes up, and things can, you know, change more than we expect.
Elizabeth Colbert, writing in The New Yorker, not somebody who usually has her hair on fire, but she wrote about the Obama environmental record recently, and it was as if she was on fire, furious, and talked about increased emissions, increased licensing for coal production, and of course offshore drilling. What's your assessment of the Obama record?
Yeah, that it's been incredibly disappointing. I mean, I didn't have high expectations, but I was still disappointed. One of the very important things that Obama inherited was expanded EPA powers to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. This had been forced into law by activists who had sued for 10 years, saying, look, the Clean Air Act covers greenhouse gas emissions, not just sulfur dioxide, which causes acid rain, but the greenhouse gas emissions which cause climate change. And they forced this through. The Bush administration finally lost in court, but refused to implement these rulings. And so then Obama was in a position to allow the EPA to do its job, to do what it's legally mandated. And he's dragged his feet on it, and that's incredibly bad. And, you know, the whole wasting 2 years on the climate legislation, his expansion of offshore drilling, I mean, people know what the record is. It's appalling. And I think particularly bad has been the role internationally, the way he gave Copenhagen the cold shoulder. I mean, people were really hoping that that would be the moment when there would be a new, serious international treaty to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Now, whether or not that would have worked is a different question, but to at least have on paper some sort of symbolic, you know, or not symbolic, some sort of real document. And the American delegation, by all reports, I was not in Copenhagen, but friends of mine who covered it, you know, the American delegation played a negative, destructive role, and President Obama did not lend his prestige and power and talk it up and undermined it. And so, I mean, that's a tremendous crime, really.
What are the tools that civil society has in this country and globally to pressure, for example, a president like Barack Obama? I mean, elected as an environmental president in the sense that people who were members of the biggest environmental groups were encouraged to vote for him. They ended up buying into kind of cap and trade. Mm-hmm. With respect to the state of forces on the civil society side, it seems to me as if you have the biggest environmental groups distancing themselves from groups having to do with war and peace. Mm-hmm. in part with the idea that if we could just get some kind of mainstream agreement about green things, we'll be better off than if we get stuck into fighting about wars and troops and, heaven forbid, the Middle East.
Or development.
What you're suggesting is this is not an either-or. This needs to be a united front. Are there any groups that really get that? And are there any that are trying to turn around the green agenda, such as it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Greenpeace does that to some extent, and the Sierra Club, which has a bad reputation on the left because one chapter of the Sierra Club in the Southwest adopted kind of racist, anti-immigrant language about a decade ago. But that was actually not the position of the Sierra Club, that was the position of this one chapter, and the national organization put the kibosh on that. And now the Sierra Club, under the leadership of Mike Brune, who was kind enough to give a blurb to this book, he came out of Rainforest Action Network, and he's directed the resources of the Sierra Club towards direct action against coal, going to the point of production of the problem, the coal fields of Appalachia, and using direct action and targeting investors and going to court and disrupting the process. And that has been effective in scuttling over 100 coal plants that were planned, have been taken off the drawing board through this combination of lawsuits, financial pressure, but then crucially to it all is like gumming up the gears with the bodies of activists who were in front of the bulldozers getting arrested, and kind of tie those other components together. So I think direct action and those kinds of strategies are very important. I'm not an expert on social movements, though, I should say, and I'm sure others could speak much better to that. But as a writer, as an intellectual, one thing I think is important at this time is to, what I'm trying to do in part in this is to also introduce categories that I think we need to talk about. And one of them is the state and government. Maybe we should say government, not the state. And think about what the role of it is and has been in terms of planning and shaping the economy. And it's often very negative, supporting the oil industry with subsidies, but we have to transform that role that the government plays in the economy. Also to think about, I end the book thinking about capitalism and what is the relationship between capitalism and nature. And Marx and Engels talked about a metabolic rift between capital and nature, which in simplest terms, capital has the potential to grow forever, infinitely, and the earth is finite. So right there is a contradiction. And many on the left argue that the solution to the climate crisis is some sort of totally new civilization. And ultimately, that might be necessary, transforming everything. But the problem with that is if we hold out for revolution, a new society, which I'm not opposed to, but if that is a precondition for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, well, we are not going to make it, and there will neither be a capitalist civilization nor some other better civilization if we have to wait decades and decades to deal with all of these problems. These, I think, are the simple scientific facts, The danger zone is at 350 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's when the best climate scientists agree that self-fueling processes get set off, such as the melting of the Arctic permafrost, which is an effect of climate change, but then it compounds the cause by releasing methane, a very, very powerful greenhouse gas, 20 times more powerful than CO2. Once those processes really get going, there's very little humanity can do. And we are now at 390 parts per million, and we need to achieve precipitous, radical reduction in our emissions now. And that means, realistically, that it's this society that has to do that. So I try and imagine, how we can break this seemingly gigantic problem of climate change and emissions out from all of the other problems that it's associated with, which together essentially make up the metabolic rift. And so I'm saying, okay, Marx and Engels, the deep ecologists, the anarchists are correct. Also, there's a lot of people who shy away from the old language of class struggle, but who talk about the growth economy and stuff like that. But they're all essentially talking about the same thing. They say, that's the key problem, and it has to go. I say, okay, granted. But that can't be the precondition for reducing emissions, because if it is, we're not going to make it. So that means, even if you dislike capitalism, you have to think about how it is going to achieve these emissions. And it is not impossible. First of all, you know, corporate America hasn't had this much cash on hand for 30 years.
Right.
You know? I mean, if they were threatened with confiscation through taxation and encouraged to invest in new lines, there's plenty of money to make this transition. And, you know, the technologies exist. We have an electrical grid. We could replace what we plug in at one end, coal-fired power, with clean, you know, wind and solar and hydroelectric power, and at the other end, reduce radically what we draw from it and consume, and use and plug vehicles into it, and try and create a, you know, a carbon-neutral energy economy. And I think that the choices are that capitalism, led by, you know, government planning, etc. I'm not arguing for market mechanisms and that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the level of the entire society. But that, you know, if we're going to make this transition, it's going to be capitalist firms exploiting people's labor for a profit to create wind power to plug into this grid that gets rebuilt, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't hold that out as like my ideal for how things should be, but like we have to be very, very adult and serious about what the science indicates and what the real time frame is.
How is the Fukushima disaster, how's the Fukushima disaster affected any of this discussion? Because for a while there were many people who were arguing, because of the urgency of climate change, that was an argument for nuclear power.
Like such as George Monbiot.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Well, I mean, I disagree with that. One, because I think atomic power is too risky. But also, if you look at the time frame and you look at the numbers, it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, there's no way. Again, it's not, we can't talk about atomic power in the abstract. And when you get into these discussions with people, they rarely want to talk about these plants. They want to talk about third generation and fourth generation ones, and you know, if you were really serious about nuclear power and the government, it's like, yeah, okay, but we're not. What we're dealing with is the United States of America and these corporations and this government, and how realistic is it that atomic power is going to come online at a massive scale, a new generation of atomic power in time to save us from climate calamity? It's almost impossible. I mean, the time frame for building these plants is like over a decade. Each of them costs multiple billions of dollars. No plant has ever been built on time or on budget. And every one of those boondoggles that's invested in is money that's not going into wind and solar and trying to reduce the price of those technologies. So I just, you know, even if you just, you know, accept like, okay, we want to do that, it's just not going to work. It's too expensive, it's too slow, it's ridiculous. And I think that's also one of the functions, intentional or unintentional, that the discussion around atomic power plays is that it's a smokescreen for the fossil fuel industry. The more we talk about plants that are never going to get built, the more we talk about this atomic nuclear renaissance that's now almost 10 years late. They've broken ground on one plant down in Georgia. Maybe they'll finish it. You know, it might as well be made out of gold. It will be so expensive by the time it comes online. The more we debate this and talk about this, the more we're not talking about the subsidies that oil and coal get, how we can realistically euthanize the fossil fuel industry and replace it with something else. And so I think that the fossil fuel interests are very glad that the president is, you know, championing nukes and stuff like that.
Let's take some questions from the audience. We've got a little stack of them here. Thanks, Ruth. Oh, a big stack of them here. Let's see if they fall into any categories here. Oh, well, while we're talking local, I was thinking local when I asked about nukes. One of the questions is about, can you address Andrew Cuomo and fracking the
Yeah.
upstate natural gas drilling.
Well, I mean, I don't know that much about
Not so
fracking.
natural.
I haven't reported on it, but, I mean, the main problem with, the first problem, not the main problem, the first problem with fracking is that it's entirely unregulated, you know? So, I mean, fracking is an old process. In Vermont, where I'm from, well drillers use fracking, but they don't use these chemicals. They use water to break open and fracture the rocks. So what we're really talking about as a problem is this completely Wild West, unregulated fracking that's part of this natural gas boom that turns out, you know, as some of you might have seen in the papers recently, a lot of these companies are not making any money, and there might not be as much money in the Marcellus shale gas as they thought.
One of the questions here, I think, goes to where you were just ending. It's quite long, but I think it's well stated. We're a decade into the 21st century, and yet global states continue to focus on nuclear, coal, oil, and hydraulic fractured natural gas as primary energy sources. This despite the fact renewable energy technologies are out there. How do you account for this disconnect in our world between governments and the stark realities of our global energy future? Is well-informed futility syndrome causing people to react by burying heads in the sand, pretending the conflicts will cease? And then I would just add one little question, which has to do with, are U.S. corporations behaving differently from corporations in other parts of the world?
In the energy sector, you know, I don't really know. I mean, I think no, ultimately they're not. I mean, European companies at home in Europe are under tighter regulations, but then you see how the large European oil firms operate abroad, and it's the same kind of shenanigans.
But are they into chaos and
No, I mean, I think there's
conflict
this
and
profound denial, right?
have no children?
Yeah, I mean, there's profound denial and compartmentalization, and you know, people convince themselves. I mean, I'm guessing what the owners of the, you know, fossil fuel companies think, but I think they believe the lies that they promulgate to the society at large. And they think that environmentalists are exaggerating, that scientists are, you know, wrong. There's tremendous compartmentalization, you know, as individuals. Sociologists who've studied this question, Leslie Sclair is a British sociologist who studies this, you know, as individuals, a lot of corporate CEOs are very concerned about the environment, but then they have a role to play, and they have, you know, a limited role within the whole machine. They just analyze the investments for a big company. They don't really decide where the investments go, or, you know, whatever. There's endless justifications based on compartmentalization that allow people to either deny the realities or to live with the tremendous cognitive dissonance of being involved in the destruction of the planet, and knowing it's bad but doing it anyway. And I mean, we all do it to some extent, right? We all have a tremendous capacity for cognitive dissonance to know that this civilization is not sustainable and to carry on flying across the country. And, you know, I do it myself.
We've got 3 plastic glasses here, but we do at least have a jug.
This is
and
true.
no bottles. I guess they're not glasses once they're plastic. Anyway, nobody asked this, but I like this idea of well-informed futility syndrome. At the political level, is it well-targeted campaign contribution syndrome? I mean, if you think of Clean Air Act, the 70s, and how you got to today, what happened? I mean, Rachel Carson would have thought we were on some good trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that, but it's also the battle for ideas, which unfortunately I was just talking about the urgency of, you know, the meeting the deadlines of the climate, but the battle for ideas is a long haul, and part of the story of the right's ascendancy is rooted in Hayek, you know, the Austrian economist who in the 1930s sees the rise of collectivism, socialism, New Deal liberalism, and convenes a bunch of powerful intellectuals right before the war. And they come up with basically a plan to promulgate a different ideology of economic liberalization. And Hayek writes openly about this in an article called Socialism and the Intellectuals, and this group after the war becomes the Montpellier Society. It's not a conspiracy, it's an intellectual movement. And Hayek's point is, he says, look, this is going to take a generation to beat back the left. And we have to do what the left did to us, which is fight the long war of ideas and not get caught up on winning this battle or that battle. Realize you might lose every battle, but if you keep fighting this war of ideas and keep asserting your assumptions and keep explaining how the world works in your terms, after 20 or 30 years, you know, if this is well organized, we'll win. And that's exactly what happened. And it comes out of the Montpellier Society and Hayek's recommendations comes the modern right-wing think tank movement. And, you know, the new right is intimately connected to that. Corporate America is recruited. So now you have someone like Michelle Bachmann. Well, is she a climate denialist because she got $80,000 from the fossil fuel industry, or is she a climate denialist because she now exists in a milieu conditioned by almost 2 generations of this ideological warfare that holds the market as infallible and constantly pillories and attacks and critiques the state? So, you know, it's campaign contributions, but it's also the longer, larger, broader struggle that took ideas seriously, took institutional power seriously, took the role of intellectuals, people who, you know, spread ideas through society. Not necessarily, Hayek says intellectuals are not people who come up with ideas and make ideas. They're the ones who trade in, you know, the second hand of ideas and educate the masses, journalists and filmmakers, stuff like that.
Michelle Bachmann talks about the EPA as a job killer. How is this discussion affected by chronic unemployment? In the sense that I think people's appetite or just tolerance for any discussion about changing anything else about their economy has become tougher.
I mean, we've moved far afield from the book, but I mean, that's right. I mean, the forensics of it, I think, would be, you know, that, I mean, I have, you know, real sympathy for the green jobs argument and agenda, and it didn't have any powerful champions. Organized labor did not get behind it. I mean, the Apollo Alliance, which is now more abundant, I mean, what was it? It was like a website and you know, a few part-time people. There was no serious money and time invested in organizing behind the rebuilding of the economy around clean technology. And on the other side, there was a concerted and well-funded effort to attack the science, and they found, you know, several footnotes in the IPCC's 4th assessment report. One that was really egregious and embarrassing about the rate at which the Himalayan ice pack was melting, and it wasn't based on a peer-reviewed paper, and it was really outrageous that had slipped by. But then, you know, the Koch brothers, ExxonMobil, these capitalists. The Koch brothers are, by the way, followers of von Hayek. They're like sort of second generation Hayekian activists. You know, and they paid for this messaging and rolled back any discussion of green jobs. So now there's no point of traction for that. And the EPA is not a jobs killer. You know, the best way to create jobs would be to write off all that capital, which is the coal and oil infrastructure, and capture all that cash that corporate America is sitting on and force its reinvestment to create clean technology. I mean, that would create jobs. That would then create spending. That would turn over the economy. But we don't have that conversation because labor is incapable of shaping debates, investing in ideas and messaging as much as it really should. The administration isn't doing that, and the right is the side in the fight that takes ideas very seriously and knows how to master that terrain, it seems.
I'm not getting cheerier as I'm listening.
Okay.
And these questions are not going to produce anything cheery either. Maybe this one. Any suggestions for how the state and democracy can be as nimble as capitalism when climate-induced chaos occurs? Are there some templates for response? She asks, hopefully.
I think that again, I'm going to come back to as a writer, it's like I don't particularly feel that my role is to recommend specific actions to activists. I feel like I should be much more involved in organizing and activism myself. But, and that's, I feel bad about that. But so that as a writer is how I address this stuff. And it then comes down to the question of ideas and arguments. And one thing that I see happening sometimes in crisis, and something that we should do, is reassert the legitimacy of the government and reassert the legitimacy of the government as the representative of the people in times of crisis. We all have the opposite model in our mind with Katrina, where it became a demonstration of government incapacity and incompetence. But I was just in Pakistan, and I have an article in The Nation about that. And interestingly, I mean, people in Pakistan do not like the government very much at all. But during the worst of the flooding, the relief efforts seemed to go pretty well. And it was in hearing their stories about how the relief worked, and it was like this idea that the nation came together. The military, despite all their faults, all their corruptions, all the fanatics in there with power, pulled helicopters out of Kashmir, pulled them away from the tribal areas, and started distributing food to people. And there was a way in which the collective came to the fore during the worst part of the crisis. And it seemed that we're going to confront more moments like that, and that in those moments of crisis, a lot can be explained, and that we should, one, push for progressive intervention by governments, and continue to critique the repressive aspects of the state, which are in this country and many countries massively overdeveloped, but to always illustrate what the other potential is of how the collective can be represented through planning, through collective organization as embodied in the government. And
one other question to which you'll say this isn't your job, but if you could make a dream team to lead Project Adaptation in the United States, who would you have on it? And if not names, and what kind of people? Is it sociologists? Is it economists? Is it engineers?
yes, it would be those kinds
Writers.
of people. It would be those kinds of people. I don't know, but it would be, it would be people from all walks of life thinking about how all of these pieces combine. I mean, it's not, because we don't have these discussions, because we don't try and plan for this, we're just at the beginning of it. And I mean, it's hard for me to imagine what could come out of a couple of years of discussion and planning and experimentation about how we should try and adapt to climate change.
I mean, it does seem as if your story that you're painting, and one of the questions is how do you make these connections, and is it a hard case to make, highlights the problem of how progressive politics has come to be in recent times, in the sense that we've been taught for at least a decade now that the most effective thing is to pick one target and try to establish an achievable goal and go for that one thing, be as tightly focused as you can. And the picture that you paint is the opposite of that, that we're not going to be able to even change any of these elements without looking at the whole superstructure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm arguing both. That adaptation has to be social justice. It has to have social justice at the center. There has to be an international redistribution of technology and capital to help the global south adapt to the amount of climate change that we are locked in for, even under the best case scenario. And I'm also arguing for specific actions and narrowly focused agendas, like just cutting emissions and developing a clean energy sector. But I think that we have to, at the same time, maintain a broader critique and hold out a kind of a hope for, well, not a hope. We have to have a kind of holistic and radical analysis, even when we're engaged in specific, limited, reformist struggles. I mean, I feel like this debate always comes down to the same thing, in that we've kind of solved it intellectually as a society, but we're just not, our organizations are not investing people and capital in trying to do this. But the way social change happens best is when there are reforms that mean something to people here and now, but that also push the ball down the field for the larger agenda. And this has been known for, 150 years by organizers in this country and around the world. And I don't see any new twist on that. I don't have any new twist on that to offer, but just I would hope that we could kind of return to that.
Some bigger rhetorical arguing, even as some of the small targets are tackled. A couple of the questions here have to do with sort of party politics. What do you think will happen if environmental regulations if a Republican is elected to president next fall? Do you think such a person can promote the growth of renewable energy?
I doubt that would happen. I don't think that would be on their agenda.
Although electing a Democrat didn't do us much good. But if both Democrats and Republicans accept money from corporations, isn't it time for public financing of elections? And also support for a third party like the Green Party or Independent Party?
Yes, sure. But the question is, how do we build power? What institutions need to be built up? And I mean, I think, this book is not, this book is a very pessimistic, dark book. It's not about like progressive social movements that much. I mean, a few of them appear in here. It's mostly about armed bands of men going around burning things and shooting people. And then smuggling guns and weapons. The world, the world as it is. The world as I found it when I traveled it. Since all these questions are about social movements, and I am not an expert on that, the one thing I would say is that I don't think there's any revival of the U.S. left without a revival of American organized labor. I think that historically, if you look at, you look at the role of the personnel, the money, the ideas that labor contributed to, like the civil rights movement and all the other great movements in our history, it's crucial. And that there's no revival without a renovation of organized labor.
I'm with you on that. Two questions from me. One has to do with what have the media been interested in, as you've done a few interviews today, and do you get a sense of the media's appetite for this question? I'm thinking now of the money media, many of whom are owned by corporations deeply invested in exactly this energy economy, not to mention the military economy.
Well, I have only done sort of progressive media so far. Did Martin Bashir and MSNBC, and he's a pretty smart guy, and we had a very quick interview, but it was about conditions in the global south and the problem of failed states and the connection between militarism, economic liberalism, and climate change. One thing I have found that I'm sure will not be a surprise to anyone is that, other media frequently cloak an ideological agenda of quiescence and acceptance of the status quo in a kind of language of being positive and not being a bummer. And it's not about like, don't be too critical of the system, we're trying to protect it. It's more like, don't harsh the audience so much. And then, that becomes a very blurry line. Like, when are you trafficking in ideas that are forbidden, and when are you harshing the audience's mellow? And
how do you convey a sense of urgency without a little harsh?
Yeah, I don't know. That's not one of my strong suits, so.
My other question has to do with your continuing motivation to go to some of the hardest places in the world to report and to bring back some of the harshest stories. How do you deal with it?
Well, I've kind of tapered off. I'm not covering war.
This book is filled with it.
Yeah, but I'm not. My plans are not. I'm tapering off on covering war, basically. I made a film with my colleague Ian Olds, who's here somewhere, about a colleague of ours, a fixer, who was murdered by the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so, some people continue to cover war, and I'll continue to travel and cover war to some extent. But I'm actually kind of tacking in another direction of thinking more about history. Yeah, so.
Want to tell us any more?
That's why I'm dealing with it by sort of easing off on the going to war zones things. I'm getting a little old for that. I mean, some people can do it the rest of their whole lives, but my sensibilities.
Did it till she was in her 80s.
That's true.
I guess fine, a lot of these have to do with what can we do. And I guess, even though it's not your area of expertise, as you've established, to each of us as individuals, you've talked about the power of the state, we've talked about the problems with politicians. What can we do that is effective, do you think? Not just in our consuming habits and all the rest of it, but in our information-seeking habits, and yeah, in our consciousness, in the sense that I'm hearing these days even that the movement for biofuels is causing dislocation of people in the Southern Hemisphere. That some of the things we're taught here are the solution and the helpful to creating a green economy are actually part of the problem. How do we piece it together? Where do we go for information that will keep us on the rails?
You know, the obvious ways of staying informed. I mean, I think like biofuels there are very few Greens who still promote biofuels because precisely what you say, and also because they essentially function as a battery, right? You take fossil fuel energy and you grow corn with it, and then you turn that into ethanol, and you essentially store the original energy from the fossil fuels in the ethanol, and then you burn it. And I mean, it's a complicated battery, and it's another one of these canards that, like hydrogen, like atomic power, that is not really green and not feasible technologically. But with biofuels, there's a specific thing, of course, that it's swing states. So it's, buying these swing states like Iowa. Corn prices have gone up tremendously, in large part because of the schedule that the U.S. government has set out of adopting greater and greater amounts of ethanol and gasoline. But in terms of individuals, people have to read the news, but I also think people should read books, which is why I wrote a book. And in terms of being political actors, I think we need to be involved with organizations, and I fault myself for not being more involved with organizations. I'm going to start teaching at Brooklyn College. I have a temporary appointment there for this year, and the union there is very strong, and I plan to help out and do my part. But I think that they're just colossally filthy fuel source that seems to be coming online, and that the United States is prepared to build a pipeline up into Canada to facilitate getting those fuels to market, and that has to be stopped. And so, that's something practical people can do.
All right. Thank you very much. Christian Parenti.
Thank you.